So you decided to embrace the warp and play the Psyker Psykinetic. It's a great choice, and one of the more interesting classes I've played in any game, but making that decision is only the first step in tapping into true power of the Psyker. Hey there friends, it's Codiak here, welcome back to Legacy Gaming. Today, we're diving into the Psyker Psykinetic and breaking down my endgame Warpthrower build. If you're watching this video, I'm going to assume you already know the basics of the class, but if you don't, I strongly recommend you check out our Ultimate Starter Class Guide already posted on the channel. A few things have changed since launch, but 95% of that video still holds up today. In this guide, we're going to build out a Psykinetic that's both satisfying to play and incredibly effective in the endgame. The beautiful thing about Darktide is that there are a million different builds that work, so don't take this as some min-max perfect endgame setup, because that's simply not the case. At the end of this video, you'll understand the benefits of this loadout, the strengths and weaknesses of the playstyle, and hopefully be well on your way to embracing the warp, just like I have. To start, let's look at the weapon, specifically the ranged weapon, the Rifthaven Purgatus Force Staff. This weapon, like all of the Psyker staffs, have multiple unique attacks. When you left-click, you send out a blast of warp energy, almost like a burst of flames. This ability does cause some stagger, which is really the first highlight of the build. Stagger is an incredibly powerful utility effect in the game, especially when you consider how fragile the Psyker truly is. When you hold down the right mouse button, you begin to charge up the weapon. As it's charging, you can left-click and release a constant stream of warp energy, much like a flamethrower. This all has the same properties of the standard quick attack, but deals far more damage because of the consistent stream. The real drawback with this weapon is the lack of range. Both the light attack and the special attack have a limited range, which forces you to engage enemies much closer than you normally would with a gun or one of the other staffs. This actually works out okay because of the feats that we choose, but we'll get there. I'll level with you guys, I really didn't like this weapon to begin with, but as I started to fool around with different feats, I realized there was a powerful build here just waiting to be unlocked. The main thing to understand is that this weapon just doesn't bring a ton of outright killing potential to the table. If end of mission scoreboards were a thing, something that will eventually be in the game, I would wager that this build would net some seriously high damage, but would be amongst the lowest in terms of kills. That's because this weapon shines within a group composition, and if you build to that strength, the damage potential only gets better, which you'll understand more when we talk about the traits. As far as the melee weapon goes, there's a bit of flexibility here. I have used a number of different weapons in this build because, quite frankly, it's not a melee-focused build. What's important is that you don't neglect your melee choice. In most cases, the only time you're going to use a melee weapon is when you get swarmed with enemies and you need to push them back or quickly clear out a path so that you can escape and get back to unleashing your warp attacks. I personally opt for faster weapons. I find I like a much quicker playstyle, but like I said, you have flexibility. Moving on to traits, this is where the real magic happens. Keep in mind, this build is technically one you can only achieve when you reach level 30, but there's nothing saying you can't work towards this as you're leveling. In fact, I would argue this build just gets stronger as you reach each subsequent tier, but it's far from toothless until you reach that level cap. Column 1 deals with a few different toughness options. I've tested all of them in various combat scenarios, and the one I find performs best is Essence Harvest, which replenishes 30% toughness over 5 seconds when gaining a warp charge. You'll see in a minute that we're going to lean into this concept of gaining warp charges, and together I think the synergy works best for the class. Column 2 is actually where I had the most trouble figuring out this build. Ultimately, I landed on Psykinetic's Wrath, which provides a 5 to 15% damage increase with force weapons based on your current peril. As I've already mentioned, your force staff is the centerpiece of this build, and your peril will constantly be fluctuating as you use that staff, Brain Burst and Quell Peril. I do think the other two options are strong in certain scenarios, but just not within the context of this build. For me, column 3 is when things really start to get interesting. I chose Psychic Communion, which gives you a 4% chance to gain a warp charge whenever you or an ally in coherency kills an enemy, flat out. This is the primary way you'll gain warp charges within this build. Yes, you can still Brain Burst, but the key here is to embrace the team aspect of this game and lean into coherency. As you might guess then, this build is much stronger with an established team that communicates well and stays together. That doesn't mean it's not effective with pickup groups, but it definitely requires more work on your part. Column 4 is a really important defensive pick. Because of the playstyle of this build, something we'll talk about shortly, I opt for Kinetic Shield, which reduces the amount of toughness damage you take by 10 to 33% based on the number of warp charges that you have. The goal is obviously keep 4 stacks of warp charges at all times, which means 33% damage reduction, but it's going to fluctuate based on your skill at keeping the buff up. Because the Psyker is the squishiest class in the game, the damage reduction to your toughness is a huge defensive boon and a much stronger option when you consider that ranged attacks are, for the most part, going to be the thing that really gives you trouble in most missions. Moving into column 5, this is another pick I really struggled with. Ultimately, I landed on Kinetic Flare because of the synergy we're trying to build with passive warp charge generation. Even with the cooldown, this effect triggers a lot during a mission and provides either a new warp charge or replenishes the charge you already have. Plus, the effect has a 10% chance to trigger on all attacks, which means the time to proc is quick once the internal cooldown has expired. There's also a case to be made about kinetic overload, especially if you're really skilled at keeping warp charges maxed out, but once again, until the scoreboard gets implemented, we can't compare raw damage numbers. Finally, let's take a look at column 6. If synergy is our focus, it's a pretty obvious choice to take Ascendant Blaze, which applies Soul Blaze to all enemies hit with our active ability Psykinetic's Wrath. Those enemies then take Soul Blaze, and when they die, there's a 10% chance of you gaining a warp charge. Expelling your peril isn't always going to be a perfect scenario, but if you manage to hit even a decent number of targets with your active ability, the chance of you getting at least 1, if not more warp charges back is pretty decent. The more enemies, the higher that probability. This is also a decent feat that ties into the idea that this build is centered around high overall damage. The other 2 feats in this row are strong, but not really applicable to this build. Hopefully you've been able to pick up on the common thread tying this build together. The idea is to really double down on passive warp charge generation. Gaining those passive charges gives both offensive and defensive boosts, and that's an important thing to factor in when you consider the harder difficulties in the game. Having synergy across all of your feats is really pivotal to the effectiveness of this, or any build really. With our weapons chosen and feats locked in, I think it's time we put everything together so you can understand the full impact of the build. Putting this build into practice is a lot of fun. In fact, I think that's something most players that try this out will pick up on almost immediately. There is this pure cathartic joy that occurs when you set everything on fire with your warp energy, and with the added support of the feats, it's pretty clear this build isn't just fun, but strong as well. For the majority of a mission, you'll be using light attacks to stagger enemies and apply the burn dot to the enemies your team is trying to kill. The objective here is mass coverage, letting that dot do the heavy lifting. Again, this is about maximizing damage, not you yourself getting the killing blow. When confronted with hordes or large groups of enemies or even elites, it's fine to switch over to your channeled attack. I find this to be wildly effective at actually thinning the herd, but your mobility is limited during this time, so it leaves you a bit more exposed. As long as you stay in coherency range, you should passively be gaining warp charges, and obviously 4% isn't wickedly high, but it's enough that you'll see its effects consistently. The more enemies, the more likely it is that this will proc, but there's another thing we need to consider: Brain Burst. This is the core ability of the Psyker Psykinetic, and still has a part to play within the build. First and foremost, it's the most effective tool for killing high-priority targets. Working with your team, you should use Brain Burst to take out elite enemies, such as bulwarks or crushers, that would otherwise be inaccessible to your team. The Psyker Psykinetic is uniquely skilled at taking out those enemies before they even become a problem for your team, so it's important not to forget this core aspect of your kit. Brain Burst is also a great way to maintain a full stack of warp charges. Let's be honest, this build does have elements of RNG, and if the goal is to maintain maximum uptime on your warp charges, you can use Brain Burst to refresh your stacks and keep the benefits from Warp Siphon and your other feats. Peril is also something worth talking about. The goal is to maintain high peril above 50% at all times. That way we gain the most benefit from the increased damage from the feat. Because the warp attacks from the weapon don't have huge peril costs, it's easy to quell as necessary to avoid reaching that 100% critical state. You want to maintain high peril so you can capitalize on the damage increase, but you also can't keep your peril too high that you can't utilize the full power of your weapon, which is why 50% is a nice benchmark. The final thing to consider is your active ability, Psykinetic's Wrath. This is a great pure peril dump, but it's also important you try and maximize its impact by hitting as many targets as possible. Because of the feats we selected, that's going to reduce the amount of time it takes to build back up your warp charges. Psykinetic's Wrath is also an important defensive tool. This build requires you to stay much closer to melee range than you're really designed to, and it's easy to become encircled by enemies. This is when you're at your most vulnerable, and when you can use your active ability at a non-optimal time to clear space and give you the flexibility to reposition. As I've said a few times throughout the video, this build is a ton of fun to play, and when utilized correctly can be a huge asset in a team composition. This build's strengths include high overall total damage, mob control in the form of stagger, passive warp charge generation, excellent damage support for your team, and more defensive capabilities than other Psyker builds. In terms of weaknesses, you have to consider the need to be in closer proximity to the action to be effective with your weapon, the build's dependency on coherency, and the element of RNG that controls some aspect of warp charge generation. Overall, it's a high-performing build that has served me well in my Darktide experience, and I think you'll have just a lot of fun with it. There you have it, our Warpthrower build for the Psyker Psykinetic. If you enjoyed this build guide, check out our Thunderstruck build for the Zealot, and of course, let us know what class you'd like a build for next. While you're commenting, don't forget to leave us a like and consider subscribing. We've got more Darktide content planned, and it'll be dropping very soon, so don't miss out. Finally, if you want to support the channel, how about picking up a piece of Legacy Gaming merch? Our first ever collection is available to buy right now on our website, legacygaming.gg/shop. You can pick up a shirt, hoodie, or hat, and all the proceeds go back into helping build our channel. There's even some charity designs that help fuel our Leave a Legacy initiative, so go check them out. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.